All right, in this lecture, I want to talk to you about installation follow-ups for WordPress. There are a lot of things that are easy to sort of forget to talk about once you get started with WordPress, but there are things that I think are super important for you to consider in advance. Even if you don't necessarily remember all of these things, you can always come back to this once you sort of get going, so that you know, can either troubleshoot or back up or at least know what you need to know about your installation. Okay, so here are the things we're going to cover. All right, I'm not going to read all of these. If you want to pause, you can read through them. Otherwise, we're just going to hit them one by one. Okay, so let's start off with where do I develop? Okay, so your question might be, do I use localhost or do I use the class server? Well, no matter what, you must turn your work in on the class server. So it might be easier to develop in the cloud if you don't want to develop in two places. In a previous talk, I talked about the disadvantages and advantages of each. One of the things that can sometimes happen on the class server is that just so you know, occasionally, you know, if you have a network issue or if there's any kind of stuff going on the server, since it's a shared hosting account, you know, you might end up having issues if the server's slow or if the network is slow, and that can be frustrating. But no matter what, you still have to have it turned in on the server. So ultimately, you have to work on the server one way or another. Another option is you can develop on localhost too, so that you always have a functional backup on your own computer. Okay, my recommendation, you should develop locally, and then as you make successful changes, perform the same actions or changes on the class server or in the cloud. If you find this is too redundant for you, then you probably should just develop in the cloud. But, you know, a lot of times in the past, students have developed only on the class server, and then for whatever reason, maybe they messed up their backups or they forgot to back up, or they backed up and then later they threw the backups away, not realizing they were important, and then they lost everything. So at least if you develop locally and also in the cloud, you'll always have a live functional version of your site whenever you need to later go and migrate it to another server for your portfolio. Okay, so backing up WordPress, this is really important. There are two things to back up, files and the database. One without the other is almost the same as not backing up at all. Okay, so if you back up only the files, you will have to completely rebuild your site. This is basically like not having a backup at all. That's sort of, you know, kind of the worst and most common scenario, especially for beginners, is that you think you grab the files out of the file system and you're done because that's what you're used to doing. But you have to get that database. Okay, but if you back up only the database, you know, you'll have to reconstruct all custom plugins, widgets, styling, templates, themes, and media resources that you uploaded to the site. Now, don't worry if you don't know what those things mean yet, but you'll see that it could be a real problem if you know you only have the database. But at least if you do have the database, it's kind of better in some ways. Depending on how big the site is, it's kind of better than, you know, only having the files. Okay, so I'm just reiterating, back them both up. All right, so let's look at how to back up the WordPress files. And before we do that, this is also going to address how to understand the difference between the WP core files and your site's unique files and like where each of those things are stored. Okay, so I jumped into FileZilla really fast, and I'm using that 025 student account as an example. And so I went ahead and I connected to the class server, and this is showing you how you would back up your files on the class server and grab those and put them down on your own computer. So basically what you've got here is you've got your project 2 folder, that's my WordPress site. And before I could just take this whole project folder and just drop it on my desktop. And you'll notice here that I've got my desktop path on my left side, that's my local side. And so if I want to back that up, what I would do then is just take it and drag it and drop it over here. I'm not going to do that because I don't really want to take the time to do that right now. But if you look inside of this project 2 folder, I want to show you where some really critical key components are. And this is something you can always come back and refer to later, or just take notes now. Most of the files in the top level of the WordPress folder are going to be what are considered to be core components, with the exception of two things: the WP content folder and also this WP config file. This WP config file is the one that we created when we were installing on the server. When we set up the database connection. So it has your database connection information. It also tells the WordPress installation which prefix to use for its tables, so it knows which tables to go and look for inside the database. You'll see later that you can actually technically make multiple WordPress folders point to one database, but we'll get to that later. So this WP config file is really important to back up, and so is this WP content file. You really should back up the entire folder, like this whole thing, you know, because also you might have, later you might have a hidden htaccess file in here that's really important to the functionality of your website. And if that's the case, then, you know, not backing up the entire folder, you're probably not going to grab that htaccess file, but that would be something else that's really important and that's going to typically be custom to your own environment. Now, the WP content folder, let me show you what's inside of that. We have plugins and themes, all right, and then this index file, but it tells us basically what to do with plugins and themes. So your plugins are going to be all of the plugins that you've installed. Later I'll show you how to install plugins in WordPress, but if you don't back up your plugins, you're going to have to go and get them again. And if you made any custom changes inside that plugins folder, then you're going to have to figure out how to redo that if you don't back this up. Also, your themes folder. Your themes folder is where you're going to basically have your theme that you're going to use. And so without this backed up, you know, any kind of style changes that you make to the style sheet or any other kind of custom changes that are made within that theme that you're using are going to be lost. So to reiterate, let me just go back and point this out. So in my project 2 folder, the things that I would be most concerned about backing up would be, if I didn't have, I should back up and say, if I didn't have time maybe to download the entire project 2 folder for some reason, and it was really important I get the content really fast, then the WP content folder is the most important, and also the WP config file is very important. Okay, and then also if you had a hidden htaccess file, that would be important too. The rest are core files that are going to basically not be touched by you. They shouldn't be touched by you, and they're ones that you can always refresh just by refreshing the WordPress installation, and then just, you know, changing out your WP content folder and your config file. Okay, let's go back to our slideshow. Okay, so now we need to look at how to back up the WordPress database. Okay, so now what I did is I went ahead and I went to the phpMyAdmin website for the server, and I want to show you a couple of things. One is that I have the site that I installed in the demo from the server open here, and then also I have my localhost version open over here. We can click on the Student 25 version, and you see that we've got our tables installed and stuff. Right now I'm going to focus on backing up the stuff from the class server, because, you know, if it's on your localhost computer, then it's on your localhost computer. And what I show you how to do with the class server, you could still also do with localhost as well. Okay, so I'm going to focus on connecting up to the database in phpMyAdmin and backing that up. So what I would do is select the database to use, which is, in my case, student 025. And I think my connection timed out, so I had to reconnect. Anyway, and so I'm going to choose student 025. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up where it says export. And then off to the left, you see that these are automatically all selected. These are all the tables, all right, that are in that database. So while all of those are selected, and here's what it looks like when it's not selected. So if I then say select all, I'm going to take all of those, and SQL file is the standard backup, and so that's exactly what I want. You don't have to modify any of this. and I'm going to click on Save as File, and then I'm going to change the name of the file, and I'm going to call it, let's just call it, this is the way I like to do it, so you can do whatever you want, but let's call it project 2, and then I'm going to put an underscore, and I'm going to put today's date stamp, and then that way I always know what that date, current date backup was. So in this example, let's just make up a date here, and let's say that it's 09/18/14. Okay, so that would be like September 18th of 2014, for instance. All right, and then I can hit go, and then it's going to go ahead and download that, or it's going to ask me, I guess, where I want to download it. You can either download it into your downloads folder or like directly into your project folder, but wherever you do download it, I would download it in a place where it's going to make sense. So for now, I'm going to put it in my downloads folder, but I would put it in some other kind of more useful looking folder. All right, now I want to show you what this looks like. If you were to just click it right here, probably you know, your computer is not going to know what to do with it. Like mine is trying to open it in Adobe Edge Code. Okay, well, let's just, and it's going to sort of start to open it. And what it told me is that there was an error, and it might have a memory problem loading the entire file. So you can also load it in something like TextEdit, or if you're on Windows, Notepad, and you shouldn't get any kind of memory error unless the file is just gigantic, and that means that you have a gigantic website. But let me just show you what this is doing. Anything that starts with 2 dashes is a comment. So it basically is for our eyes only, not for the server. And then anything else is going to be something that is a command for MySQL. And it tells me that it's from the database student 25. And basically, if you actually, you know, look at this, you don't have to fully understand this. I know we didn't really go over how to write SQL queries, but what you can see is that it's giving commands to MySQL to create a table called P2 comment meta. All right, and then it's telling it what columns to create and what types of columns those columns are supposed to store for data. All right, data types, remember that? Okay, and then it gives some other information that we're not going to go into right now. But basically it creates the table, but then it says, okay, now we're going to dump all the data. Well, there isn't any data for that particular table because this is a brand new installation for me. So let me show you something that does have some data. This is a table called comments. Well, by default, WordPress automatically puts a couple of comments, or maybe just one comment, I don't remember, into WordPress so you can see how a comment looks. Well, here's where highlighted is where it's creating the table, and now it's saying dumping the data for that comments table, and that means that it's literally dumping all the records that were in it, and it says insert into, and it gives you the data that's going to go back into that table. And I want you to notice when it says create table, insert into, these sound like productive kinds of commands, things that are going to produce new data. Well, that's because when you dump a SQL file, it actually creates the instructions for restoring that same file. So that basically these are all SQL queries that you can just copy and you can paste in as a SQL query and it'll work. Or you can just import the file and it basically will recreate everything. So in the next demonstration, we're going to move forward with our little hit list of follow-ups, and I'm going to show you how you can actually delete the tables from this database and feel confident about actually restoring your files.